All right, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Hello. I am Dr. Xavier Savels. I'm an instructor as well as the undergraduate student coordinator for the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, and welcome to another SouthTalk series. Let's give a hand for SouthTalks. Yes. Before I introduce our speaker, one brief announcement. Be on the lookout for tomorrow's SouthTalk that's going to be here at noon in the Overby Center Auditorium. That speaker will be Heather McTeer-Toney, who will be discussing how the South's environmental history, ranging from agriculture to extractive industries, has shaped individual and collective behaviors in the region. But let's talk about our speaker this evening, Dr. Marc Aidinoff. Dr. Aidinoff is an incoming assistant professor of the history of technology at Harvard University. Very nice. His current book project, Rebooting Liberalism, examines the experiences of welfare in the U.S. South in order to understand the changing politics and practices of an increasingly digital system of government. He traces the work of Southern policymakers who believed that they could make the welfare state popular with white voters by computerizing the mechanisms of governance. By doing so, Dr. Aidinoff explains the transformations of the United States welfare state from a localized system of uneven entitlements to a national regime of extraction. A strong believer in the value of historical inquiry to analyze and also to craft public policy, Dr. Aidinoff has served as a policy advisor for both the Biden and Obama administrations, and he received his PhD from MIT, has taught here at the University of Mississippi, but also Harvard, MIT, and the Rosedale Freedom Project. Without further ado, Dr. Aidinoff.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Savels, and thank you to this center, which has really been exceptionally warm and welcoming to me over the years. So today I want to make an argument about the post-civil rights movement South. And in the post-civil rights movements, white Southern democratic politics have been marked by this repeated effort to depoliticize, to take the politics out of many racialized political questions by making them technological questions. So therefore, in order to understand these questions, to reopen that black box, we need to look at technical objects to resurface these changing normative choices. What that means, to sort of buckle up, is that we need to look at the most boring parts of government to see how the hard parts of politics have been buried under those technological choices and how they've arrived to us with this logic of assumed progress, that one step comes after the other without questioning how those choices were made. So to do that, I want to tell the story today not of a person, but of a system, and the largest computer system in Mississippi for some time. It was the largest in both the private and public sector. The Mississippi Application Verification Eligibility Reporting Information Control System. I've got other acronyms if that's your thing. But so Maverick's biggest computer in the state. And in honor and to mark the subject of Southern environments, I really think this sort of technological environment is what we're living in. And so I want to narrate the story of Mavs, and many of the pieces actually are still running today. Undergirding my talk and my research is the realization that ethnographers have noticed for some time, that citizens know well, that the experience of poverty was and is mediated by a computer system. What does that mean? That means when you go to get your entitlements of citizenship, when you go to the government, you're no longer interacting with a person, you're interacting with a computer. And so this is the shift that happens in the 70s and 80s. It used to be a caseworker would come into your house and decide if you were deserving of the entitlements of citizenship. So here's a still from a movie called Claudine from 1974. Caseworker comes into Claudine's house. This is a common occurrence across the country as part of welfare. What's the caseworker looking for? Signs of income that's not reported, or most often signs of a man in the house that would make Claudine not eligible for welfare. So she'd look for an extra pair of shoes, she'd look for a razor by the sink. That system shifts, as my research shows, to this computerized system. And we start to get a story that looks like this. So this is the Bolivar commercial in Rosedale. This is Mrs. Evelyn Wilkinson showing off the new computer system. And the experience of welfare is coming and sitting across from a woman like this and being interviewed and having your narrative story translated into codes that she's going to put into the computer. So these are what are called deprivation codes that Wilkinson would use, or an eligibility work would use, to show why you had suffered sufficiently to be entitled to certain kinds of payments. So everything in your narrative story would be translated into these two-letter codes. So the question that's going to animate my talk today, it's a South talk, was Mavericks Southern? Is this Mississippi technology actually a deeply Southern thing? And what's at stake in that question? So the plan for the talk is to ask what's at stake in asking if Mavericks is Southern. I'm going to try and answer that in 3 different ways. Who actually built this thing? What did it actually do? And then what were the politics of this kind of system? So people here have sat with me in 602, and we've asked the question, why is there this myth of the South as perpetually out of time, stuck in the past, or lagging behind modernity? And you see examples of this both from the political left and the political right. So I think of, this is when I was just doing archival research, just a quote in the newspaper, the Bolivar commercial celebrating a historical day. The rest of the nation was always too busy keeping up with capital P progress to have time to collect memories and to tell stories. Only the South had a past, and hence only the South had a perspective on reality. But you also get this from, and sorry, the date, this is 2002, you also get this from folks like Bob Moses, who comes down to help organize Freedom Summer, and he notes that the Mississippi Delta, he says, not only missed the Civil Rights Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution as well. And so you see this recurring theme of the South as outside of modernity as a cornerstone to myths about what Southern identity is. The scholarship repeatedly insists on a thoroughly modern South, that is the South that isn't disconnected, that has never been disconnected, that the story of slavery in the US South is fundamentally tied to the story of US capitalism, but then the Mississippi Delta, that the rural South has been a particular site of modern innovation. And then there's a turn coming out of here to think of this as the global South as an American colony, part and parcel of modernity. I want to highlight one article from our own Ralph Eubanks, your own Ralph Eubanks, that really inspired some of my research, which is thinking of what does it mean that Wired magazine, the leading technical magazine in the United States, commissioned Ralph to write this article, The Land That the Internet Era Forgot. What does it mean if you really push against the reality that the South is supposed to be out of time, and yet what is the work of connecting it technologically? In my research, I think of what this modern technological environment looks like. You have this sort of bucolic scene, but we all know the way in which the crops here have been technologically modified. You see the chords dividing the sky. And then this is the Robert E. Lee building in Jackson, and you can see the chords going there. That's the building where Mavericks is held. And I think this is very much part of the modern technological South that may be encased in something that's telling a story as though it has this history of being the Robert E. Lee building, but is actually containing something thoroughly modern, that computer system Mavericks that's running this. And so again, this is the computer that was first in the Robert E. Lee building. This is an IBM 370. that was put into the state of Mississippi to run Mavericks. So who built Mavericks? In 1969, the Jackson Daily News reported that Mississippi state agencies were, quote, pretty proud of having their own computers because, quote, nothing in today's business world rates as a status symbol quite like a computer, complete with all its flashing pinball-type lights, its distinctive printing style, and its boneheaded mistakes. It goes on to say Mississippi state agencies had 20 computers. Illinois only had 2. The Okie state of California must be indigent with just 1. In their zeal to modernize, Mississippi had overbought computers by like 20 times, right? They had been a very easy mark for particularly IBM salesmen and salesmen from other companies that went agency by agency and preyed on this fear of the South as not being modern and sold the promise of a modern South. Robert Crook, a senator at the time in the Mississippi State Senate, gets wind of this. He's a very aggressive auditor of state programs. And he decides to build technological capacity in the state and sets up the Mississippi Central Data Processing Authority. His solution to these accusations that Mississippi is not modern, is stuck in the past, is to build the internal knowledge and be a leading state in terms of internal state data processing capacity. So basically, have a really, really state-of-the-art IT department that blows away its neighbors, which he does successfully do. He finds the Department of Welfare has bought 2 computers to do the same job. He cancels the IBM contract for the second computer and is extremely proud of having saved the state about $250,000 in today's money, canceling that second contract. So what's at stake in this kind of story? Why is Robert Crook going around town telling everyone, we're going to find out who's bigger, Mississippi or IBM? Why does he take on IBM in such a way? One answer is to save money. The other is the politics of what IBM came to represent at the time. IBM is not some bastion of progressive values, but it was a strong supporter of the Johnson administration and an integrationist employer. So this is contemporaneous to setting it up. This is IBM reaching out and to try and diversify their workforce. This is an ad in Ebony magazine. We could sort of do a close reading of this kind of image of how they're making very clear that they're not the same firm they used to be, of just all white men in white suits. IBM is also very involved in Johnson administration efforts to define what poverty is and set standards for a minimum wage. So Thomas Watson chairs the Heinemann Commission, which recommends some minimum wage increases. I will also add that IBM is an eager participant in Johnson's executive order. So if you read to integrate and to actually take affirmative action steps as a federal contractor. So some of you might have read recently that that executive order was overturned. This was the executive order that's giving IBM a politics that does not line up with Crook's own politics. Crook was a campaign manager for Ross Barnett. Exactly what that means, whether he was the only campaign manager, it seems like there were a few people who claimed credit, but he was a segregationist who literally was opposed by Fannie Lou Hamer. And so here's where I like to see that politics is not sort of this abstract thing. You get an election result between Fannie Lou Hamer and Robert Crook. Crook is, for those who sort of know the Mississippi names, Crook is a protege of Jim Eastland. He's Jim Eastland's representative in the state Senate. And so it makes sense that this is the same district that Fannie Lou Hamer represents, and she does lose to him. But think of this as coloring that same impulse to set up a central data processing authority, to set up internal capacity. Part of that impulse is to assert a certain kind of technological sovereignty over the state. The last piece of this that I think is really important to understand of why Mavericks gets built is in the context of a growing welfare rights movement in Mississippi. And the welfare rights movement in Mississippi pushes particularly to integrate welfare offices and change who a caseworker is. So you see nationally a lot of critiques of clients' power, that's welfare recipients asserting their right to payment, but you also see concerns that who a welfare agent is, think of that image of Mrs. Wilkinson at her computer, that starts to change. And so first you have black eligibility workers, which was a major demand of the welfare rights movement. And then you start to see in 1980, black county directors. So the question I know you've all been waiting for, who actually built Mavericks? After I've told you this tight little story about Mississippi sovereignty, you follow the machine and you find a mess. In 1979, you could tell that story of technological sovereignty. They want to build their own system, and it's not going to be IBM, it's going to be internal. By 1982, it's clear that some help is needed. So EDS is hired. For those of you who remember Ross Perot, this is Ross Perot's company. This is how Ross Perot makes his money. The federal government, which is going to support some of the development, worries that EDS and the Central Data Processing Authority have been so enthusiastic. They've built a machine that's far too complex, is far too big and impressive. Again, that desire to build something bigger and more impressive. So they say, actually take from another state. And they send the Mississippi team, decides to save money, and go. They visit Wisconsin, Delaware, and North Dakota. And then they hire a team of consultants from Arthur Andersen to transfer the North Dakota system, which is called TEX, to Mississippi. It pilots in Rankin County, and then it's operational in 1989. One of the things I really like about this story is computers suddenly become something that's really hard to place historically, because it's both responding to the politics of 1979, when this vision gets created for what we need to build, but it's actually operationalized. It's actually changing people's lives in 1989. And so you see that big disconnect, and see this exchange among states, this technological federalism where ideas are moving state to state. So what does Mavericks actually do? The first thing it did is what all computers do. It broke all the time. And I think this is in some ways the most important experience of the computer, is it not working. And so this is CPU usage. So for those of you who, when your computer's overheating and it says the CPU usage is maximum, when it's at 100, it just doesn't work anymore. There's no compute left. And so here are the days of the month from 4 to 28. And you can see, you might be lucky if you went in the afternoons, sort of towards the end of the month, because everyone rushes in the beginning of the month. You might also notice that this calendar starts at 4, because of course you can't go in the beginning of the month, because that's when the software update happens, right? So this is the experience of living in a computerized welfare state. This is what modernization actually means, is people coming to the office and getting turned away. In this system, the welfare workers no longer have the power to make the determinations themselves. So if you think of that earlier model, where the critique is of the welfare worker coming into your home who completely controls your life, under the technological system, the welfare worker doesn't have the power either, unless it's at 3 p.m. on the 25th, when she can try and help you figure out how to use the system. One example of this really failing that was really remarkable is when they piloted it in Forest County. That's where Hattiesburg is. And this is Sella Weary, who's a volunteer. Volunteer, interestingly enough, because the budget cuts have been so extreme, you don't have enough staff. So she's there, and she posts this sign that says, actually, if you got a check, please return it, because the system accidentally gave everyone 2 checks. We don't know who got 2 checks, so everyone needs to bring all their checks back. We're going to recollect them. We're going to have a ledger and then reissue them. And that's the only way we can make this work. And I really feel for Miss Weary in this picture, because there's nothing she can do. That the critique of the welfare worker, of this all-powerful employee, really is true in the earlier period. And here you have someone begging people to come back, and the experience of the computerized, modernized state is throwing the kids back in the car, grabbing your checks, and handing them back over, and hoping you get mailed some new ones. The third thing it did was it changes what an entitlement actually means. It linked welfare payments and debt collection. So I'm going to walk you through this sort of technical diagram, and this is an example of my sort of conviction that it's in the most boring sources that you get sort of where the rubber meets the road here. Here's Mavericks. Here's the Mavericks database, keeping track of all the 4A, which are all the welfare payments to which you're entitled, and it's connecting them to child support and saying for each Mavericks payment, for each AFDC payment, for each welfare check you receive, someone actually has to offset that. And you see a growth of this notion that child support debt should equal the welfare entitlements, and they should match at the level of the person. And so we should make this child support system, it shouldn't operate independently, that's CS child support, separately from welfare. They actually need to be linked systems. So this is a pretty radical idea, right? Child support, one thing, alimony, what's owed, welfare, entitlements to the state. Actually, these should be unified systems. And this is incredibly hard. And this is a contract that the Central Data Processing Authority really takes on. Here's another diagram of the technical work. It's hard without going through the minutes to just experience how much the people doing this hated, how buggy this work is, because you have the AFDC cases. So here are all the little files of the cases. And they all have their children. And all the children need to be associated with different APs, absent parents. That work of name matching is incredibly technologically difficult. And so what's the thing that the Central Data Processing Authority is spending their time on? Doing that connection. I really think that this is a fundamental change in what an entitlement means. It means that instead of it just being money that the state's giving to you, it's tied directly to money you owe the state, and it's tied through that individual linkage. The fourth thing it did is it offered a politics of welfare without explicit reference to race or rights. So welfare is, sort of as I talked about a little bit at the beginning, the hot button issue. It is a centerpiece of the civil rights movement, of the welfare rights movement. It is what Reagan is attacking, and it is what, when he's attacking welfare queens, and it is what Democrats are sort of getting behind when they start attacking deadbeat dads. You see, instead, there's a promise. If you look at the Department of Public Welfare, says, this is their annual report from, checking the year here, I think in 1987. As you review this year's annual report, you will find that it reflects a government agency that runs more like a business than a bureaucracy. The first bureaucratic response to increasing client needs is automatically more staff. This is the last response that our department has because we analyze every other business method in dealing with the problem beforehand. So here you have This isn't just that this is a turn towards business as a solution, but it's a solution that prevents having to hire people. The state can be really slim, it's not going to grow, and it's not going to be a big deal. I mean, you see just looking through these reports that I was just going back through again in Jackson, people start to disappear. If you look at the early annual reports of the Department of Public Welfare, they're full of pictures of people. And you start to see a way towards diagrams of business flows, and strangely enough for Thomas Britton, a lot of horses. He really liked horses as sort of his metaphor for efficient teamwork. And you see again here this draining of contentious politics. That letter was to Ray Mabus, who was the governor of Mississippi. And I think Ray Mabus is someone who really embodied the political promise of technological efficiency as a potential path forward for young Southern Democrats. And he really did this very successfully as an electoral strategy in 87, 88. And so here's a cover of New York Times Magazine, The Yuppies of Mississippi, this young, technocratic, Democratic governing elite. And here's a cartoon that I think Afton shared on Ray Mabus and Buddy Newman. And I think this captures a different way of framing politics. So Ray Mabus has a plan for reorganization as simple as the wheel. You know, this is just the logical progress of technology. Buddy Newman has this obviously ridiculous wheel of he wants to keep government as it is. This could be framed very differently. Buddy Newman is a notable segregationist. He joined, I wrote down what year he joined the Mississippi House. In 1948. So this is someone elected in 1948. He becomes speaker in 76. And it is not surprising that he's fighting with a young, much more progressive, much more racially inclusive governor. But all of that, all of the substance is pushed aside with this sort of way of talking about things as the natural progression. This really is this regional approach really does work for all of the Southern Democrats in this period. So this is in 1988. You have a picture of Bill Clinton, Ray Mabus, and Buddy Roemer on the Mississippi River outside of Rosedale, Mississippi. They also all traveled to Japan together to gather foreign direct investment, to look and see how they can modernize the state. And you see this really, they really do hone this set of skills and identity. And I think no one better takes that nationally than Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, so same story could be told with Bill Clinton, where as governor, he's very proud of having paired the welfare roles through computerization. Again, it wasn't a hard decision, it was just the numbers the computer gave me. And then he really comes to prominence as the leader of the National Governors Association, leading the national efforts on welfare reform. And so here's a quote that I think is particularly instructive when he's testifying before the Senate Finance Committee. And he says, every welfare recipient should sign a contract with the state, making a personal commitment in return for benefits to pursue an individually developed path to independence. And that is that change of welfare into a contract. And this is a different kind of contract than the child support contract, but it's that same, it's not an entitlement, it's not a right, something in return. But then he goes on to say, this contract has to be enforced not only on the part of the recipient, but on the part of the state through a case management system. In other words, he goes and tells the Senate, we can only reform welfare if we computerize the entire system so we can really track people effectively. And he tells this as a governance solution, but it's equally for Clinton a political solution. And Clinton takes this and rides this approach, among others, to the White House. He picks another young Southern reformer someone who is famous for loving technology and technocratic solutions. They launch a Reinventing Government campaign, and it's pictured here where they have bulldozers of paper reports that they've eliminated. The government's going digital. There are lots of accompanying pictures of them at computers, how they're, these are called Atari Democrats, but they're actually moving past that. But see this modernizing impulse. So the political promise of technological efficiency, I think, is really part of something that they develop as an identity here. Not that it's inherently Southern, as in it grows from the soil, but it's inherently Southern as it was a strategy which developed and only worked electorally for a very short amount of time, but did work electorally nationally in this period. So where does this leave us? This is the bummer. I tried to think of like a happier conclusion, but a welfare state that is fairly decimated with little positive case given to a right to welfare. So that is sort of long gone when we're talking about technological improvements, when we're talking about how to fine-tune the contract. And child support has increasingly become this key to the social safety net. So welfare in Mississippi is more or less AFDC welfare, gets replaced by a program called TANF by Clinton. In its current form, it's basically non-existent. It's serving fewer than 2,000 families any given month in Mississippi. Those families are making a couple of $100s a year from those funds. About 43% to 47% goes to what's called non-assistance. So the money that Mississippi does get goes to programs to encourage work. And so this is covered pretty extensively in the latest iteration by folks at Mississippi Today, covering the Brett Favre scandal. But there's something even deeper than when the money's not misspent. 43% of it isn't supposed to be going to people by the current design. The operations that I described, that sort of Central Data Processing Authority, has really hollowed out and turned over a lot of their work to contractors. That desire for Mississippi government to be a leader in technological know-how has changed over time. So again, I'd point you to sort of the Mississippi Today piece that's going to follow through Anna Wolf's reporting. And then I'd also encourage you to take a look at what is left of the Central Data Processing Authority legacy, and take a look at the Department of Public Welfare in its new Human Services Form website, which does mostly operate through chatbot, an award-winning chatbot called Jen. And so you interact if you have any questions about child support, if you have any questions about what welfare you're owed. You don't go to an eligibility worker as your first stop. You don't have someone come into your house as a first stop. The first stop is to ask Jen. Thank you.